The son of the damp earth in the Appalachians, the child who could never keep his flesh together. This is not a legend whispered around campfires. This is not folklore passed down through generations with embellishment and exaggeration. This is the documented reality of a family hidden deep within the Appalachian Mountains of eastern Kentucky, a family whose bloodline folded back upon itself so many times that nature itself began to unravel in the most horrifying ways imaginable. The year was 1967. The Vietnam War raged thousands of miles away, but in the remote valleys of Pike County, Kentucky, time seemed to have stopped somewhere in the previous century. Here, in a region known locally as Harlan Hollow, a cluster of weathered cabins clung to the mountainside like forgotten relics. The nearest town, a coal mining settlement called Blackwater, lay 17 miles away along roads that became impassable rivers of mud whenever the rains came. And the rains came often to these mountains, turning the red clay soil into a slick, treacherous landscape that isolated the families even further from the outside world. The Pritchard family had lived in Harlan Hollow for 5 generations. What began as 2 brothers who settled there in the 1870s, fleeing some unnamed trouble from Virginia, had grown into a web of interconnected bloodlines that defied conventional family trees. By 1967, nearly every person living in that hollow shared the Pritchard name and shared far more than that. They shared grandparents who were also great-grandparents. They shared parents who were also cousins, sometimes first cousins, sometimes closer relations that had no proper name in polite society. Sarah Pritchard was 17 years old when she gave birth to the boy they would come to call Thomas, though he would never respond to any name, never speak a single word in his brief and agonizing existence. Sarah herself was the product of a union between her mother and her mother's own brother, a relationship that had produced 3 children, 2 of whom survived past infancy. Sarah's father, if that term even applied, was her mother's first cousin, making the genetic pool from which she emerged so shallow that it was more puddle than pond. The cabin where Sarah lived with her extended family sat at the end of a narrow path that wound through dense forest. 18 people called this structure home, a ramshackle building that had been added onto haphazardly over decades, creating a maze of rooms connected by sagging doorways and floors that sloped at disturbing angles. The roof leaked in a dozen places, and during heavy rains, the inhabitants would position buckets and pans to catch the water, creating a constant metallic symphony of dripping that echoed through the darkness. On the night Thomas was born, a cold rain fell steadily, turning the world outside into a grey curtain of water. Sarah's mother, Martha, served as midwife, as she had for countless births in the hollow. Martha was 42 years old, but looked at least 60, her face lined with deep creases, her back bent from years of hard labor and the weight of genetic burdens that expressed themselves in chronic pain and early aging. She had delivered 11 children herself, though only 4 survived past their 5th birthday, and 2 of those bore visible marks of their twisted heritage. The labor lasted 14 hours. Sarah's screams echoed through the cabin and out into the rainy night, but no one came to help because there was no one else to come. The nearest doctor was in Blackwater, but families like the Pritchards did not go to doctors. They did not trust outsiders, and outsiders had long since stopped asking questions about what happened in places like Harlan Hollow. When Thomas finally emerged into the flickering lamplight of that cabin, Martha's weathered hands trembling as she received him, the room fell into a silence more terrible than any scream. The baby did not cry. He could not cry. His mouth opened and closed like a fish pulled from water, but no sound emerged because his throat had not formed correctly. But that was not the worst of it, not even close. Thomas's skin had a strange, almost translucent quality, as if the layers that should have been opaque had never fully developed. Beneath this thin covering, the muscles and tissues seemed to shift and separate with the slightest movement. Martha, who had seen many children born with defects in this hollow, felt her hands go numb with a horror she had never before experienced. As she lifted the infant to clear his airways, she felt something give way beneath her fingers, a sensation like pressing into overripe fruit. "Lord, have mercy," Martha whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain drumming on the roof. "Sarah, honey, something ain't right." Sarah, exhausted and delirious from the pain and blood loss, reached out with shaking arms. "Give him to me. Let me hold my baby." And what Martha placed in Sarah's arms that night was something that would haunt everyone who witnessed it for the rest of their lives. Thomas was alive, his chest rising and falling with shallow, rapid breaths, but his body seemed to be in a constant state of dissolution. His skin, where it held together at all, was mottled with deep purple and red discoloration. In several places, particularly around his joints and along his spine, the skin had simply failed to close properly, revealing the raw tissue beneath. But the most disturbing aspect became apparent within the first hour of his life. As Sarah held him, trying to provide warmth and comfort, she felt a dampness spreading across her arms. At first, she thought he had urinated, a normal function for a newborn. But when she pulled back the thin cloth they had wrapped him in, she saw that his skin was weeping. Not blood, not any fluid that had a medical name that these people would know, but a clear, yellowish seepage that seemed to come from everywhere at once, as if his body was trying to expel itself from the inside out. The other women in the cabin gathered around, their faces pale in the lamplight. These were women who had seen death in many forms, who had buried children and husbands, who had endured hardships that would break most people, but none of them had seen anything like this. "What do we do?" asked Rebecca, Sarah's aunt and also her half-sister, through the tangled web of relations that defined their family. "Should we take him to Blackwater, to the hospital?" Martha shook her head slowly, her eyes never leaving the struggling infant. "Hospital won't take him. They'll ask questions. They'll want to know about the family, about who the daddy is." She paused, glancing at Sarah with a mixture of pity and something darker. "They'll take him away, and they'll take Sarah too. Maybe take all of us." The truth was that Thomas's father was Sarah's own uncle, her mother's brother, a man named Jacob, who was himself the product of a sibling union 2 generations back. Jacob was 34 years old, but had the mind of a child, another common outcome in families where the bloodline had circled back on itself too many times. He could perform simple tasks, could work in the small garden they maintained, but he could not read or write, could barely speak in complete sentences. The relationship between Jacob and Sarah had not been forceful in the traditional sense, but neither had it been a choice made with full understanding on either side. It simply was, accepted as normal in a place where normal had been redefined by generations of isolation and genetic catastrophe. Confira se já é inscrito neste canal because the stories we uncover here are the ones that society buried, the truth that history tried to erase, and every video reveals something that will change how you see the world forever. The first week of Thomas's life was a descent into a special kind of nightmare that medical textbooks, even in 1967, had documented, but rarely in such extreme form. The condition had a name, though none of the Pritchards would ever learn it: epidermolysis bullosa, combined with a catastrophic array of other genetic disorders that could only occur when the family tree had no branches, when it was instead a pole driven straight down through generations of the same corrupted genetic material, recycling itself over and over. Sarah tried to care for her son with a desperation that was heartbreaking to witness. She fashioned soft cloths from the few clean pieces of fabric in the cabin, trying to create barriers between Thomas's fragile skin and any surface that might damage it further. But everything caused damage. The act of holding him caused his skin to separate from the tissue beneath. Changing the cloths that served as his diapers left patches of skin adhered to the fabric, revealing raw, weeping flesh underneath. The cabin took on the sweet, sickly smell of decay, a scent that no amount of opening windows or burning sage could dispel. The other residents began to avoid the corner where Sarah kept Thomas, not out of cruelty, but out of an instinctive revulsion that they could not control. Children who lived in the cabin, Sarah's younger siblings and cousins, were forbidden from going near the baby, though their curious eyes would peek around doorframes, trying to catch a glimpse of the thing that made the adults speak in hushed, frightened tones. Martha attempted to provide what comfort she could, drawing on generations of folk remedies and mountain medicine. She made poultices from herbs gathered in the surrounding forest, comfrey for healing, plantain for inflammation, golden seal for infection. She brewed teas from willow bark to try to ease what she imagined must be constant agony. But nothing helped. Thomas's condition did not stabilize. It worsened with each passing day. By the 10th day, the areas where his skin had separated had expanded. His arms from shoulder to wrist were now almost entirely raw. The muscles, tendons, and blood vessels were visible through the thin membrane that remained, pulsing and twitching with each shallow breath he took. His legs had begun to show the same deterioration. Most horrifying of all, the skin on his face had started to slide away, pooling in loose folds around his neck, revealing the skull structure beneath, the muscles that controlled expression, the ligaments that held his jaw in place. Sarah stopped eating. She sat beside the small wooden box they had fashioned into a cradle, lined with the softest materials they could find, though everything was too rough for Thomas's dissolving flesh. She would stare at her son for hours, tears streaming silently down her face, her lips moving in prayers to a God that seemed to have abandoned this hollow long ago. "Why did this happen?" she asked her mother one grey morning, fog rolling through the valley outside, muffling all sound until it felt like they existed in a world separated from reality. "What did I do wrong?" Martha sat down heavily beside her daughter, her arthritic joints popping with the movement. She was silent for a long time, struggling with how to explain something that she herself only partially understood, something that was whispered about but never directly addressed. "Sarah, honey," Martha began, her voice rough with emotion, "this family, we've been alone up here for too long. Your grandma used to tell me stories about how it was when she was young, how there used to be other families in this hollow, people with different names, but they left one by one, moved down to the towns or further away, and we stayed. We only had each other." "But Thomas," Sarah's voice broke. "He's suffering, Mama. Every moment of his life is suffering. I can see it in his eyes when he looks at me. He knows something ain't right." Thomas did seem to possess an awareness that was somehow worse than if he had been born without consciousness. His eyes, one of the few parts of his body that remained relatively intact, would track movement in the room. When Sarah spoke to him, those eyes would find her face and hold her gaze with an intensity that seemed to communicate the agony he could not voice. Sometimes his mouth would open wide, his jaw working, trying to produce the scream that his malformed throat could not create. And the silent anguish was more terrible than any sound could have been. The family began to fracture under the weight of Thomas's presence. Arguments broke out over trivial matters, tensions that had simmered for years, suddenly boiling over. Jacob, the father, retreated further into himself, spending days in the forest, only returning to the cabin when darkness made navigation impossible. He could not bear to look at what he had helped create, could not face the physical manifestation of the family's cursed bloodline. On the 15th day, Martha made a decision. She walked the 17 miles to Blackwater, her feet blistering in worn shoes, her breath coming in ragged gasps by the time she reached the small general store that served as the town's social center. She used the payphone outside, one of the few modern conveniences that had reached this isolated region, and called a number she had memorized years ago but never used. The voice that answered belonged to Dr. Helen Morrison, a physician who had worked in the Appalachian region for 12 years, one of the few medical professionals who showed any interest in the isolated communities scattered through these mountains. Martha described Thomas's condition in halting, simple terms, leaving out the details of his parentage, though she suspected the doctor would guess the truth. "I'll come tomorrow," Dr. Morrison said, her voice professional but not unkind. "But Mrs. Richard, you need to understand that if this child's condition is as severe as you describe, there may be nothing I can do except make him comfortable." "Comfortable," Martha repeated, the word feeling strange in her mouth. "Yes, ma'am, that would be something." Dr. Helen Morrison arrived at Harlan Hollow on a cold morning in late March, the sky the color of old bruises, threatening rain, but holding back for the moment. She drove as far as the road would allow, then hiked the final 3 miles on foot, following Martha's directions and the faint path worn through the forest by generations of Pritchard feet. The cabin, when it came into view through the bare trees, looked like something from a previous century. Smoke rose from a stone chimney that leaned at a precarious angle. Laundry hung on lines stretched between posts, though it seemed to hang there more from habit than from any expectation that it would dry in the damp mountain air. Chickens scattered as the doctor approached, their startled clucking the only sound besides the wind moving through the branches overhead. Martha met her at the door, her face showing the strain of the past 2 weeks. "Thank you for coming, Doctor. We don't get many visitors up here." The interior of the cabin was dim, lit by a few windows, with glass so old and warped that looking through them was like viewing the world underwater. The smell hit Dr. Morrison immediately. The unmistakable scent of necrotic tissue combined with unwashed bodies, wood smoke and poverty. She had worked in conditions most physicians would refuse, had seen suffering that would have broken softer souls. But something about this place sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the temperature. Sarah sat in a rocking chair in the corner, the cradle beside her. She looked up when the doctor entered, her eyes hollow, her face gaunt. She could not have been older than 18, but she looked ancient, as if the past 2 weeks had aged her decades. "May I examine him?" "Doctor," Morrison asked softly, setting her medical bag down on the rough wooden table. Sarah nodded, unable to speak, and gestured toward the cradle. Dr. Morrison had prepared herself for something severe, but nothing could have truly prepared her for Thomas. She had seen birth defects before, had treated children with genetic disorders, had worked in burn units where patients suffered from similar skin conditions. But Thomas represented something different, a confluence of genetic disasters that created a situation so extreme it seemed to defy possibility. She pulled on latex gloves and gently, carefully, moved aside the soft cloth covering the infant. Her professional composure slipped for just a moment, her eyes widening, her breath catching in her throat. Then she recovered, her training taking over, her mind cataloguing what she saw with clinical detachment, even as her heart broke for this suffering child. Thomas's skin had continued to deteriorate. Large portions of his body were now completely raw, the epidermis and dermis separated or absent entirely, leaving exposed muscle tissue that glistened wetly in the dim light. Areas of infection had set in, despite the family's attempts at cleanliness, evidenced by greenish discoloration and swelling. The fluid that wept from his body had soaked through multiple layers of cloth, and the smell of infection and decay was overwhelming this close to him. But it was his eyes that haunted Dr. Morrison most. Those eyes were aware, intelligent, trapped in a body that was essentially dissolving around the consciousness within. They tracked her movements as she conducted her examination, and she could swear she saw recognition in them, perhaps even gratitude that someone with medical knowledge had finally come. "How old is he?" Dr. Morrison asked, though she already knew from Martha's phone call. 17 days, Sarah whispered. 17 days, and every one of them has been torture for him. Doctor, can you help him? Can you make him better? Doctor. Morrison sat back, carefully removing her gloves, choosing her words with immense care. She had to balance honesty with compassion, medical reality with the emotional needs of a mother who had just given birth to her dying child. Sarah, I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to be completely honest with me. It's very important. She paused, making eye contact with the young woman. Thomas's condition is genetic. It's caused by problems that were present before he was born, in his very cells. Do you understand what I'm saying? Sarah nodded slowly, tears beginning to stream down her face again. The severity of what I'm seeing suggests that both of his parents carry the same genetic mutations, the same problems in their blood. This usually only happens when the parents are related to each other. Do you understand? The silence that followed was broken only by the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the soft, wet sounds of Thomas's labored breathing. Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice barely audible. His daddy is my Uncle Jacob, my mama's brother. But doctor, that's just how it is up here. That's how it's always been. Dr. Morrison closed her eyes for a moment, fighting back the surge of anger and sadness that threatened to overwhelm her professional demeanor. She had suspected as much, had seen evidence of inbreeding in other isolated communities, but never to this degree, never with such catastrophic results. Sarah, I'm not here to judge you or your family, but I need you to understand something very important. Thomas has multiple genetic disorders that are all expressing at the same time. His skin condition alone would be life-threatening, but he also has malformations of his internal organs, his skeletal structure, his neurological system. Even if we could somehow heal his skin, even if we could stop the deterioration, he would still face a lifetime of severe medical problems. Can you take him to a hospital, somewhere with machines and medicines that could help? Dr. Morrison shook her head slowly, gently. A hospital could make him more comfortable, could give him pain medication, could try to prevent infections. But Sarah, I need to be very direct with you because you deserve the truth. Thomas is dying. His body cannot sustain life much longer. The kindest thing we can do for him now is to ensure that he doesn't suffer more than he already has. The sound that came from Sarah was not quite a scream and not quite a sob, but something in between, a noise of pure anguish that seemed to come from the deepest part of her soul. Martha moved to her daughter's side, wrapping her arms around her, both women weeping openly now. Dr. Morrison opened her medical bag and removed a small bottle. This is morphine. It's a very strong pain medication. I can show you how to give him small doses that will ease his suffering without causing him harm. It won't cure him, but it will make the time he has left more peaceful. She spent the next hour instructing Martha and Sarah on how to administer the medication, how to keep Thomas as clean and comfortable as possible given his condition, how to recognize when the end was near. She left them with all the supplies she could spare, promising to return in a few days, though she suspected that by then Thomas would be gone. Right now, I want you to do something. Close your eyes for just a moment and imagine being trapped in a body that's falling apart while your mind stays completely aware. That's Thomas's reality. If this story is making you feel something, if it's making you understand the real horror of what generations of isolation can create, then leave a comment with just these words. Some secrets should never have been kept. Let me know you're still here, still listening, still bearing witness to this forgotten tragedy. Thomas survived for 11 more days after Dr. Morrison's visit. 11 days that felt like an eternity compressed into moments. The morphine helped to some degree, bringing a glassy-eyed calm to his awareness, but even through the medication's haze, his suffering was apparent to anyone who looked at him. The weather during those 11 days seemed to mirror the mood in the cabin. Rain fell almost constantly, turning the paths through the hollow into streams of thick mud, isolating the family even further. The sky remained a constant grey, so oppressive that it felt like living under a tombstone. The dampness seeped into everything, making the cabin's interior feel cold and clammy, no matter how high they built the fire. Sarah barely left Thomas's side during this time. She would doze occasionally in the rocking chair, jerking awake at any sound from the cradle, terrified that he might die while she slept, that he might face that final moment alone. Martha brought her food, which Sarah picked at without appetite. The other residents of the cabin moved around her like ghosts, speaking in whispers when they had to speak at all. On the third day after Dr. Morrison's visit, Jacob finally came to see his son. He stood in the doorway of the room for a long time, his simple mind struggling to process what his eyes were showing him. Finally, he moved closer, standing over the cradle, looking down at Thomas with an expression that mixed confusion, horror, and something that might have been recognition of his own complicity. "I'm sorry," he said, the words coming slowly as they always did for him. "I didn't know this would happen. I didn't understand." Sarah looked up at him, her face haggard, her eyes red from crying. "None of us understood, Jacob. None of us really thought about what we were doing, what it meant for the children we brought into this world." "Will there be more?" Jacob asked. "More babies like Thomas?" "No," Sarah said firmly, perhaps the first truly decisive statement she had made in weeks. "No more babies. Not for me. I can't do this again. I won't." Martha, who had been listening from the next room, felt something shift inside her, a recognition that perhaps this tragedy, this unspeakable suffering, might finally be the thing that broke the cycle. She had known for years that the family's isolation and intermarriage was creating problems, had seen it in the children who were born with physical deformities, mental limitations, chronic health conditions that no mountain remedy could cure. But knowing and acting on that knowledge were different things, and it had been easier to maintain the status quo, to pretend that this was just how life was in the hollow. Dr. Morrison returned on the 5th day after her initial visit, hiking through the rain with grim determination. She examined Thomas, noting the progression of infection despite their best efforts at care, the way his breathing had become even more labored, the paleness of his remaining skin that suggested his body was shutting down. "It won't be much longer now," she told Martha and Sarah quietly. "Days at most. Continue with the morphine. Keep him warm and as comfortable as possible. And Sarah, I want you to know that you've done everything you could for him. Sometimes love isn't enough to overcome the circumstances we're born into." That night, Sarah held Thomas for hours, something she had been afraid to do too often because of how fragile he was. But now, knowing the end was near, she wanted him to feel held, to feel loved, even if he couldn't understand what those things meant. She sang to him softly, old mountain ballads her grandmother had taught her, songs about lost love and hard times, and the hope of something better beyond this world of tears. Around midnight, as the rain drummed on the roof and the fire burned low in the hearth, Thomas's breathing changed. The rapid, shallow gasps that had characterized his brief life slowed, becoming deeper but further apart. Sarah felt it happening and called out for her mother. Martha came quickly, along with several of the other women in the cabin. They gathered around Sarah and Thomas, creating a circle of witnesses for this small life's final moments. No one spoke. The only sounds were the rain, the fire, and Thomas's slowing breaths. His eyes, which had been half closed, opened fully one last time. They found Sarah's face in the dim light and held her gaze with that same intensity he had shown since birth. And then, so gradually that it was hard to pinpoint the exact moment, his breathing stopped. His small chest, ravaged and raw, ceased its rising and falling. The awareness faded from his eyes like fog burning away in morning sun. Thomas had lived exactly 28 days. 4 weeks during which his body had slowly dissolved while his mind remained trapped inside, aware of every moment of discomfort, every separation of skin from flesh, every infection, every pain. 4 weeks that must have felt like an eternity to a consciousness too young to understand why it was suffering. Sarah did not cry out. She had exhausted her capacity for screaming, for wailing, for any loud expression of grief. Instead, she sat perfectly still, holding her son's small body, feeling the warmth begin to fade from him, feeling the weight of him become heavier somehow, as if death added substance even as it took away life. "He's at peace now," Martha said softly, placing a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Whatever comes after this, it has to be better than what he endured here." They prepared Thomas's body according to mountain traditions, washing him carefully, wrapping him in clean white cloth that immediately began to stain from the fluids still seeping from his remains. Jacob built a small coffin from rough pine boards, his limited carpentry skills producing a box that was crude but serviceable. They buried him the next morning on a hillside above the cabin in a small cemetery where generations of Pritchards lay, many of them children who had not survived their first year. The rain had finally stopped, and weak sunlight filtered through the clouds as they lowered the tiny coffin into the ground. Sarah dropped a handful of damp earth onto it, the sound of dirt hitting wood seeming too loud in the quiet morning. There was no preacher, no formal service, just a group of people saying goodbye to a child who should never have existed, whose suffering was the direct result of their choices, their isolation, their insistence on keeping their bloodline closed, even as it poisoned itself. In the months that followed Thomas's death, Harlan Hollow began to change in ways both subtle and profound. Dr. Morrison's visit had cracked open a door that had been sealed for generations, letting in light that revealed the true cost of the family's isolation. The doctor returned several times over the spring and summer of 1968, not because she was called for medical emergencies, though there were several, but because she felt a responsibility to these people whom society had forgotten. She brought educational materials about genetics, about the dangers of consanguineous relationships, explaining in simple terms that the mountain people could understand why children like Thomas were born, why the Pritchard family tree had produced so much suffering. Sarah never recovered from Thomas's death, not really. She moved through the days like a shadow of herself, helping with chores mechanically, rarely speaking, often staring off into the distance, as if seeing something no one else could see. Martha worried that she might harm herself, but Sarah seemed to exist in a state beyond even that, in a numbness so complete that self-destruction would have required more emotional energy than she possessed. Dr. Morrison arranged for Sarah to visit a clinic in Blackwater where she received a medical procedure that would ensure she could never have children again. It was illegal in Kentucky in 1968 to sterilize someone so young without specific medical necessity, but the doctor falsified records, claiming conditions that did not exist because she knew that another pregnancy, another child born of the Pritchard bloodline, might destroy what remained of Sarah's sanity. Jacob died in the fall of 1969, drowning in the creek that ran through the hollow when he fell during a storm and lacked the mental capacity to save himself from water that was only 3 feet deep. Some in the family whispered that it might not have been an accident, that he had walked into the water deliberately, unable to live with what he had helped create. But no one investigated, and he was buried next to his son on the hillside. The younger generation of Pritchards, those who had witnessed Thomas's brief life and horrifying death, began to leave the hollow. They found work in the coal mines around Blackwater, married people from other families despite the disapproval of the elders, moved to towns where their children would have access to schools and medical care. The isolation that had defined the Pritchard family for 5 generations began to break apart, slowly but inevitably. Martha lived until 1982, dying at the age of 57 from a combination of ailments that were never formally diagnosed but were likely the result of her own genetic heritage. Before she died, she spoke to Dr. Morrison one final time, asking the doctor to tell people what had happened in Harlan Hollow, to make sure that Thomas's suffering meant something, that it served as a warning to other isolated communities about the price of closed bloodlines. Dr. Morrison published a paper in a medical journal in 1984, changing names and specific locations, but documenting Thomas's case in clinical detail. The paper was titled Extreme Expression of Genetic Disorders in a Consanguineous Population, a Case Study from Rural Appalachia. It was read by other physicians who worked in isolated communities, used in medical schools as an example of what could happen when genetic diversity was eliminated, cited in studies about the importance of genetic counseling in at-risk populations. But outside the medical community, Thomas's story remained unknown. The people who had witnessed his brief life carried the memory like a wound that never fully healed, but they did not speak of it to outsiders. It was too painful, too shameful, too revealing of the depths to which isolation and ignorance could sink. Sarah Pritchard lived until 2003, dying at the age of 53 in a nursing home in Blackwater. She never married again, never had other children, never really moved past the 28 days of Thomas's life. In her final years, suffering from dementia that might have been genetic or might have been the result of decades of untreated depression, she would sometimes talk about her baby, about the son who could never keep his flesh together, about the dampness of his skin and the awareness in his eyes. The cabin in Harlan Hollow stood empty for several years after the last Pritchards left in the early 1990s. Eventually it collapsed under the weight of rain and snow and time, the wood rotting, the stone chimney tumbling down, the entire structure returning to the earth from which it had been built. Now only a slight depression in the ground marks where it stood, visible only if you know what to look for. The cemetery on the hillside is still there, though most of the markers have fallen or been worn smooth by weather. Thomas's grave has no stone, just a slight indentation in the ground under an oak tree that has grown massive in the decades since his burial. If you visit the spot on a damp morning, when fog rolls through the mountains and muffles all sound, you can almost feel the weight of all the suffering that soaked into this ground. All the children born into circumstances they did not choose, their bodies bearing the consequences of decisions made by people who did not understand what they were doing. The son of the damp earth in the Appalachians was not a monster. He was not a curse or a punishment from an angry deity. He was a child, innocent and aware, trapped in a body that genetic catastrophe had rendered unlivable. His 28 days of existence stand as testimony to what happens when isolation, poverty, lack of education, and closed bloodlines converge. His story is not unique. Across Appalachia and in isolated communities around the world, similar tragedies have occurred, though rarely documented, rarely acknowledged, buried under layers of shame and secrecy. Today, genetic testing and counseling are available even in remote areas. Laws exist to prevent and protect against the most egregious forms of consanguinity. Social services reach into places that were once completely isolated. But pockets of isolation still exist, communities where old patterns persist, where the lessons learned from children like Thomas have not yet penetrated. Dr. Morrison, who retired in 1995, kept a photograph of Harlan Hollow tucked into her medical bag throughout her career. It showed the cabin, the surrounding forest, the hillside cemetery visible in the background. She never showed it to anyone, never explained why she carried it, but it served as a reminder of why her work mattered, why reaching isolated communities was important, why every child deserves to be born with a chance at life, unmarred by the genetic consequences of their parents' limited choices. If you've made it to the end of this story, if you've stayed with us through Thomas's brief and agonizing life, then you understand why these stories need to be told. If you're new here, make sure you're subscribed, because we uncover the buried truths that society wants to forget, the human cost of isolation and ignorance. If you watched until here, leave a comment saying, "I watched until here," so I can know you and know who really enjoys the stories on this channel. Hit that like button if this story affected you, if it made you think about the importance of genetic diversity and access to medical care and education. Share this video with someone who needs to understand why these isolated tragedies matter, why history forgotten is history doomed to repeat itself. The son of the damp earth may be gone, but his story remains, a warning and a tragedy that we carry forward so that no other child has to endure what he endured in those 28 days of dissolution and awareness.